Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to The Black Tower Show. I am your host, Nathan Ford. I'm joined by Jake Fox. We're broadcasting BC Studios. Upstate New York, it's beautiful outside. The sun is shining, but we got work to do inside. William Blum, our guest on The Black Tower Show, broadcasting 1310 WRSB, 1590 WASB, Brockport, Canandaigua, Rochester. William Blum, our guest. Our honored guest on The Black Tower Show. William Blum left the State Department in 1967, abandoning his aspiration of becoming a Foreign Service officer because of his opposition to what the United States was doing in Vietnam. He then became one of the founders and editors of the Washington Free Press, the first alternative newspaper in the capital. I want to start with a quote from his book, Killing Hope. Quote, "American leaders are perhaps not so much immoral as they are amoral. It's not that they take pleasure in causing so much death and suffering. It's that they just don't care. The same that could be said about a sociopath as long as the death and suffering advance the agenda of the empire. As long as the right people and the right corporations gain wealth and power and privilege and prestige. As long as the death and suffering aren't happening to them or people close to them, then they just don't care about it happening to other people, including the American soldiers whom they throw into wars and who come home, the ones who make it back alive with Agent Orange or Gulf War syndrome, eating away at their bodies. American leaders would not be in the positions they hold if they were bothered by such things." That's William Blum from his book, Killing Hope. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us, William Blum.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Let's talk about democracy. Your recent book talks about democracy as being a very violent export. Let's talk about why democracy is a violent export.
Well, it's in the name of democracy that the U.S. carries out many of its worst interventions abroad, with the bombing and the invasions and the torture and the overthrow of the governments. It's all done in the name of democracy and freedom. And so that's why I call it a most dangerous export.
If people knew about how our government conducts business, if they knew the truth, they would be forced to change. Would you agree?
It's an amazing phenomenon, the brainwashing of the American people. If we were to define the brainwashing of a population as the gap between what the people believe about their government and what the government is actually doing abroad, based on that definition, the American people are undoubtedly the most brainwashed in the world. They have no idea of the harm and the suffering that we've caused, or they have a slight idea in many cases, but they have no idea of the immense magnitude of it and the depth of it. And that's what spurs my writing. Many years ago, I decided I was going to document these horrors to educate the American public.
In the name of stomping out communism, and that stems from a desire to not have wealth distributed amongst the people. So at its very, very core, are we not talking about greed?
Well, the corporations are one of the main beneficiaries of U.S. foreign policy, and certainly greed is their main motivation. So I would have to agree with you. But it's not the only motivation of our leaders. They really, it's also ideological. They really believe that the U.S. is the great exception in the world in history, that we have a great benefit to export to all the world. They believe that we're really fighting for democracy and freedom, and they believe that we've succeeded in doing that, in creating that often. So it's ideology. It's the idea of American exceptionalism. That's also a major factor besides the greed.
We're talking to William Blum on the Black Tower Show. Oftentimes we will hide behind the philosophical argument of protecting people's personal liberties. When people talk about living in a communist country, they talk about, well, I won't have my own personal ability to grow or gain wealth. Who is it? The government should have no say over how much money I can earn and where you find that balance. But what you're saying is that the real intention of our U.S. government has nothing to do with protecting or at least opening up a debate of whether we should be protecting people's liberties or to what degree. It seems to me that the common thread is financial. It is, to some degree, frontierism, growth, and expansion at all costs. Would you agree?
Well, it's, as I mentioned, it's not just the greed. It's they really believe their own propaganda. So it's they're being very ideological, and we have a combination of people who are behind our foreign policy. It's not just the leaders of corporations. It's the statesmen, so-called, the diplomats, the ones who go into foreign policy as their life's calling. Those people, for the most part, believe their own propaganda, and it's not to get rich for them personally. So I wouldn't use that term to apply to all those who create and support U.S. foreign policy.
William Blum, our guest on the Black Tower Show.
You see this notion of the idea of American exceptionalism in these recent debates we have over, national security, over spying, over civil liberties. You see our government, they're completely non-transparent. They hold, the Congressional Intelligence Committee holds their meetings behind closed doors. So does the Senate Intelligence Committee. The Federal Reserve, holds their meetings in secret. Everything is so non-transparent, but we demand transparency from other governments. We demand they not torture while we torture. They demand they not currency manipulate while we currency manipulate. I mean, the hypocrisy goes on. And, Americans are oblivious to the fact that, our country is just a walking Hippocratic, rogue nation, doing whatever it wants.
Well, I wouldn't be quite as harsh on all Americans as that statement implies. I think there's a core of no more than about 15%, and that's just my rough estimate, 15% of the American population who is beyond reach. I don't write for them. I write for the 85% that can be reached and can be changed, and I've gotten numerous letters from people who have been changed because of my writings and the writings of people like me. So it's not quite as pessimistic as you make it sound. There are many people who really believe what they've been taught, but are still open to change if they're told otherwise, if they're informed of the actual facts. And that's what my books aim at, to provide such people who can be reached with the facts.
Well, there are people like yourself fighting the good fight, and there are many people, being changed over, being woken up, so to speak, all the time. And I think slowly that's starting to happen, but I feel it's not quick enough because of the nature of the economic system, because of the nature in which our government moves so quickly within its propaganda. It's changing definitions of language when they're doing speeches, or when they're arguing for constitutional variances on laws and things. It's very difficult to catch up with them.
Yeah, there's no question that they are masters at what they do, but the expansion of information via the internet and elsewhere has made their task tougher. It's much easier to catch them at their lies. You find even in the Washington Post, which I read every day. I live in D.C. Even the Post will report on the lies. They won't maybe use the word lie, but they'll speak of a contradiction between one statement and another, and they'll point that out. So even that's happening more often, I think. There's just too many ways to broadcast information these days to hide the facts as easily as was the case just 10 years ago.
Do you think part of the problem is we talk a lot on the show about morality? Do you foresee any government, any governing body having a certain injection of morality? When we talk about the free market, we've had John Perkins on the show, and we've discussed this idea that there is no morality. And even going back to your quote from Killing Hope, this idea that the people that are making the decisions, they simply don't care. How is it that we inject morality? Is it even our job to somehow bring morality to the marketplace, to demand a certain morality from our government? That's what we're talking about. But that relationship has been severed. It is broken, it seems. The intent of our government is lost. You talk about it a lot. Multinational corporations, they're in bed together. Democracy has been broken. Not to sound too bleak about it. And
well, Jimmy Carter said it himself. We don't live in a democratic nation anymore. So, ex-presidents are starting to come out and say these types of things as well.
And it is about, it comes back to that argument of intent. The government's intent no longer lies in what the people need to survive, to live, to grow. So it's gone. It's been severed, just like you're saying.
I agree with what you're saying, but if we were to allow that to be the basis of the way we live, then we may as well either commit suicide or just abandon completely the public sphere and just be concerned only with our personal lives with no attempt to make any change. Now, there are many people who live that way. I know people like that. But if you choose to be any kind of activist, if you choose to take part in your society or in the world, then you have to have some optimism about the possibility of changing people's heads with information. And that's what motivates me.
Yeah, you have mentioned in past interviews about a tipping point. If people were to actually spend the time looking within themselves and trying to, gain knowledge and trying to expose truth, if people actually spent that time doing that, then there would be a tipping point. More and more people would realize it, and there could actually be a mending or some kind of social understanding, healing, call whatever it is. But that you've seen that happen in the past. You're a historian, so you see that there is some kind of cycle throughout human history where there does reach a fever pitch, where the hearts and minds of the people cannot help but to see the corruption about how our government conducts business, about how it is amoral, like you said. Because real evil is that apathy. It's not acting. It's looking at, it's kind of like the New Yorker thing, the blasé attitude, you know. Like these you're a New Yorker. I'm not saying this is you, but, you see the guy getting stabbed on the subway and everybody just goes about their business, But I'd like to think that we're not there yet, But, William,
we're discussing the same question again and again, you and I. I don't question at all that if you want to see the American people in the worst possible way, you have a good case to make. That they are very brainwashed and all the other factors we've been talking about. But I still insist that there is a growing number of people here who are seeing through the bullshit that they're fed, and people like Edward Snowden and Bradley Manning, they come out of this society. They're young people who have been exposed to all the brainwashing that every American is exposed to, and yet they have taken at great risk to themselves. They have attempted to expose this and make changes, and they are far from an exception. The support given to the two of them is very encouraging. Snowden is an international, and Manning are international heroes, and it's things like that and people like that which encourage me to keep going and to keep believing that enough people can be changed, and until eventually we might, our numbers may reach a certain, what's the term, with atomic energy. What?
Nuclear fission?
Yeah, right.
Well,
and there will be an explosion of some kind. I cannot predict the exact nature of that explosion, but I believe it will happen eventually. I hope I look to see it.
Well, I agree with you, William, and I would say that we're past the point in which George Washington described before the Revolutionary War, where he said all we need is 3% of the population willing to do something, and I think and I'm not talking about a violent revolution. I'm not talking about militarism or militantism. I'm talking about willing to get out in the streets, willing to do something, and I think we're well past the 3% threshold that he talks about.
Well past.
I think that they can't go to war with Iran unless something catastrophic and horrible happens to shock everyone into moving in that direction. I think everyone is awake and aware enough to not allow this to happen under the circumstances we're living under today. And I think that's due to a lot of people out there getting the word out. The internet itself, there's so much out there. There's so much information. And, yeah, I mean, like you said, I think we're past that threshold. And I'm just kind of waiting for the right movement or the right personality or the right idea to come along to really bring all of these aware and awake people together. Because right now, the factions are splintered. You have the right-wing kind of Tea Party that's objecting to the status quo, and you have the left-wing kind of Occupy movement, with Chris Hedges and Cornel West and things on the left, and they're splintered and they're ideologically split for sure. But there's a lot of common ground there, and I'm kind of waiting for that moment where they come together, and when they do, I'm sure the government is fearing this moment very, very much, because if they come together, there's nothing stopping it.
Yeah, but I'm more concerned, or I aim more at the expanding the left. I don't count too much on combining with the right wing. I think that's a much more difficult task than just expanding the left wing. The people on the right are basically true believers, and that will take a lot more work to undo than simply those on the left who are open to some kind of new basic point of view about their government and their society, and just need the information to mature those views and become activists. So as those I'm counting on much more than I am on those on the right, like the Tea Party. They can be really very dumb. Those people in the Tea Party, they say the stupidest things, and I'd rather spend my time attempting to educate those who are not quite that out of touch with the reality.
William Blum, our guest on the Black Tower Show. I wanted to get your thoughts on America's involvement in Egypt and what's going on there with the violence. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, if you could talk about that for a minute.
I think what's happening there is going to put a bad mark on any future democracy in Egypt. It's going to be, after what's happening now, it's going to be maybe decades before people will turn to the electoral process again. No matter even if they hold elections in the future, no matter who wins, it's going to be precarious just to hold on to that power, because everyone will think, well, what right do they have to hold to stay in office? They could be overthrown just as easily as was the Brotherhood. It's put a real bad taint and smell on the whole electoral process in Egypt, and I think it'll be many, many years before that is lost. As to the U.S. role, we're not looking good there. We refuse to call it a coup, and we refuse to cut back on our export of arms to the military, and that's good. I mean, I'm always in favor of the U.S. image being tarnished, because that's the only way to reduce the power of the empire. The empire works full time and building up its image. We are masters at propaganda and advertising, and our image serves a great function for the empire, and such things can tarnish that image, and so that's a positive thing.
Yeah, I think one of the real tragedies is the propaganda that demonizes people that are different, demonizing Muslims, demonizing poor people in our own country. It just seems that there's this war of ideas that's going on. Whereas if people were to go to these countries, 99.9% of the people, they're making bread. They want to feed their family. They have blood.
Well, I don't think the average American supports our wars because they think that the average person abroad is some kind of monster.
Yeah.
We're taught to hate the leaders of those countries, and we're taught to hate the ideology of those countries, like communism or socialism. So it's not that the average American, as stupid as he might be, he doesn't think that the average person of any foreign country is just evil. It's at a higher level. His ignorance is at a higher level than that.
I see this situation in Egypt as a further degradation of the American empire. We're essentially being thrown out of Egypt, in my opinion, in my view of what's happening there. And we're being economically thrown out of a lot of areas in the world now. Our empire is degrading, and that's, I mean, you can see it with the militarization of what we're doing, of our foreign policy. How do you think Israel is going to react to this situation in Egypt? You already saw, they violated Egypt's sovereignty recently by bombing the Sinai Peninsula. I don't know. How do you think Israel is going to play into all of this?
Well, I'm not sure about Israel, but I must take exception to what you were saying, that when you think that the empire is losing points, that it's being excluded somehow. Our military spread is greater than ever. We're expanding in Africa. Every month there's a new announcement of a new base or a new military agreement. NATO is expanding all the time. So I don't think the empire is getting any less in its reach. It's unfortunately, that isn't the case at all.
Well, it's definitely we're definitely getting more aggressive. That's for sure. But I mean, could that be a sign of a sign of fear, a sign of weakness? As
maybe in history will point out that this expansion was the last breath or the last gasp or the last hurrah, as they say. Maybe in hindsight we'll see it that way, but at the moment it just what I see is the expansion, and including surrounding Russia and China. And now we have this new Asian policies called TPP surrounding China, and I don't see much lessening of the empire's power and reach, unfortunately. And I'm not speaking of the future now. I'm speaking of the past few years and today.
TPP is really one of the worst economic pacts I've ever heard of. It takes away American sovereignty, and it takes away, China's ability to do what they want, and really gives it to multinational corporations. They can really do whatever they want. But I mean, what I see is the BRICS coming together. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They're coming together, and they're forming their own trade pacts. They're trading within their own currency for goods. Saudi Arabia is listening to what they're doing, and that's why I say a lot of these moves are out of fear in response to what the BRICS have been doing. What do you think about that?
Well, during the Cold War, one of the greatest dampening of U.S. power was the existence of the Soviet Union. The U.S. Government always had to consider, what will the Soviets do if we do this? And then once the Cold War ended, that concern and that fear was gone, and that's the period when the empire expanded to its greatest heights, and was showing its greatest nerve and unconcerned about world opinion, and that's a big loss for the world. And so anything that might replace the Soviet Union as a dampering effect upon U.S. foreign policy is a good thing, and the BRICS may serve that purpose.
William Blum, our guest on the Black Tower Show. In your opinion, who's the greatest U.S. president and why?
I don't normally think in such terms. If I had to choose one, I guess Franklin Roosevelt. He had his personal shortcomings, but his government did more to help the average American than any other administration, I think. So I would choose him.
We talk about on the show as Roosevelt's term as kind of being a point where things seem to slip downhill. Wallace, you get Truman, and you go down what seems to be kind of a dark path at that point.
Yeah, it's been pretty bad. You mentioned Carter before. Carter is much more a progressive since he's been out of office than he was while he was in the White House. I'm trying to think, was anyone else like that? Bill Clinton hasn't changed out of office. George W. Bush certainly hasn't. Maybe Obama might, I don't know. But Carter is one example of someone who was better post his White House than while he was in the White House.
William Blum, our guest on the Black Tower Show, we have to mention the quote from Osama bin Laden. When Osama bin Laden was referring to your book, Rogue State, Osama bin Laden wrote, quote, "And if Bush decides to carry on with his lies and oppression, then it would be useful for you to read the book Rogue State, which states in its introduction, if I were president, I would stop the attacks on the United States. First, I would give an apology to all the widows and orphans and those who were tortured. Then I would announce that American interference in the nations of the world has ended once and for all." Can you talk about, well, we know that you believe that, but what were the repercussions? What were the things that happened after that statement? How did that affect your career and your relationships, your professional relationships?
Well, it's the one time that I was able to get onto the mainstream media. The Washington Post had my picture on page 1 with a long article about me on the inside. But otherwise, the Post ignores me completely. I was on CNN and MSNBC and half a dozen other major TV stations, but all of which came to an end within about a week or two following the Osama announcement. So it was not anything permanent that came out of that, except for many people who became my fans as a result of that. I mean, I sold about 20,000 more copies of that book, Rogue State, than I would have otherwise. Although, frankly, in the end, it cost me money, the whole thing, because I lost my paid speaking engagements on campuses. Universities did not want to touch me with a 20-foot pole. Anyone who was so associated with Osama bin Laden, and I lost virtually all my speaking engagements. So in the end, it cost me more money than I gained.
It must be fascinating being referenced by Osama bin Laden, the most evil man in the world.
It was exciting. It was exciting being on the mainstream media and finally reaching many people that I wouldn't otherwise have reached. That was the exciting part. I didn't otherwise. It wasn't like I had a great rush of egotism. It's just I looked at it purely in terms of propaganda value for my political cause and purpose. That's how I saw it.
William Blum, our guest on the Black Tower Show. Go to williamblum.org. If you go to williamblum.org, that's BLUM. On his website, you're going to get continually updated information from the Anti-Empire Report. That's William.
Yeah, that report is something I send out monthly to anyone on my list, and you can it's free, and just send me an email to bblum6@aol.com. I'll put you on my mailing list.
That's great. WilliamBlum.org. The Anti-Empire Report. Love it. Issue number 119 begins. It's not easy being a flag-waving American nationalist. There. A little tongue-in-cheek there. It is difficult nowadays to wave the flag. It's a new America. William Blum. Thanks so much.
Thank you, William.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.